So good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to speak to you at MMU as you come to the end of your PGCE year. My name's Jo Heathcote. I was an English teacher in Manchester for around about 23 years, and I was also principal examiner at AQA for English language. I now work as a consultant in schools, freelance, and I also am the principal moderator for the international GCSE at the moment. So I'm here today to talk a little bit about developing GCSE responses for literature. There are many ways in which to do this, but I'm just going to share with you some of the things that have worked for me over the years, and some of the things that I found successful in demystifying the approach to GCSE English literature questions for students. So without further ado, we'll get started. Everything begins with the assessment objectives, which you'll have been hearing a lot about on your course. These are the assessment objectives for English literature here on the slide. I'm sure you're familiar with those by now. The assessment objectives are common to all exam boards, so this is not just AQA related. Everything begins with the assessment objectives. They're set by Ofqual, and every time a specification changes, these are the starting point that exam boards use to develop their examination papers. So they really, in a nutshell, these are the skills that are expected by the subject of GCSE English literature. In this case, you'll see them for language as well. It's the skills expected by the subject, and it also measures how the subject is assessed. So we're going to just break those down a little bit this afternoon and simplify them. And this is what I would always advise you to do with students at the start of year 10. If you're lucky enough to have your own classroom where you can get things like this up on the wall, I would always advise that as well. Always share these with your students and explain what they are, what they signify, what the expectations are. It's very hard to expect students to write an essay or write an examination answer without knowing precisely what it is you're looking for, and the AOs are the way into that. So if we think first of all about AO1, I would always say to students, well, this is actually all about you. It's all about you. It's about understanding, interpretation. It's about inference. AO1 is about showing what you've learned about maybe a character or a theme, what you understand about that character, theme, so on. It's comprehension skill, pure and simple. AO1 is comprehension skill. And that's it in a nutshell. And it's the same actually for English language as it is for English literature. AO1 is about reading with understanding, supporting what you are saying with evidence from the text, drawing out inferences to show your understanding. You'll hear lots of different acronyms, and depending on which school you've been in, all of them are absolute anathema to me and my absolute pet hate. You'll hear PEE, PEA, poodles, pedals, paddles, poodles, peasels, all sorts of nonsense. In a nutshell, what I've got here in red on the slide is what you really want them to do. And don't use the acronyms. Tell students what it is you want them to do. Make a very clear statement in response to the question. Support that statement with an appropriate quotation from the text. Draw out an inference to show your understanding. That's what we mean by comprehension. And I came up with that little adage actually having worked with a number of resit students in sixth form college who had come from schools all over Manchester, 23 different high schools. And without a doubt, the thing that tripped them up or had tripped them up right the way through secondary school was when they had to make a point, they didn't know what they were making a point about. When they had to support that point with a quotation, they didn't know what was meant by evidence. When they were explaining the PEE adage, they didn't know whether they should explain the quotation, whether they should explain the point, whether they should say what the quotation meant. That's not the same as drawing out an inference. So be very clear in terms of what you want your students to do and how you explain these assessment objectives. AO2, contrastingly, is all about the writer. It's about what the writer is doing, what the writer has chosen, what the writer is crafting their text with, their choices of language, their choices of imagery. If you're doing a play, their choice of dramatic devices. So it's like your language and structure skill for the English language papers, but maybe from a bigger box of tricks, is the way that I like to explain it to students. When you may be dealing with AO2 for English language and you're given little bits of text to work with, yes, you might be using parts of speech there, you might be looking for similes, metaphors and so on, but when you're dealing with literature, you've actually got a much bigger box of tricks to deal with. You might, if you're dealing with a play, you've got soliloquy, you've got dramatic irony, you've got use of stage direction. So think about sort of how you might present that to students. That I used to call it the little box and the big box, but you could probably think of your own way of doing that. So again here, what do we want students to do to show AO2 skill? We want them to actually identify a method using their subject knowledge, using their subject terminology. We want them to give a precise example of it. I spend a lot of time with teachers now sort of working on this idea that when they, when a student identifies a simile, we want an example of a simile, not a long quotation where we have to guess where the simile is. Obviously, we know where the simile is, but we want to know that the student is proving that they know. They identify a noun phrase, give me examples of noun phrases. Don't give me a big sweeping sentence. If you're talking about adjectives, give me some, cherry pick some adjectives out of the text. Don't give me a massive quote, 3 sentences and expect me to find them. I know where they are. Does the candidate know where they are? And finally, the commenting on effect. Always the top rung of your mark scheme ladder is about commenting on effect. And for me, the way to differentiate it for students is AO1, you're asked for an inference. You're showing understanding. Get them to say what it suggests, what it implies, what we can infer. To show effect, get them to think about themselves. What's the impact of that choice, that simile, that metaphor, that group of noun phrases, that semantic field? What's the impact of that on them? And I always use a little triplet here. What does it make you think of, feel, imagine? And then they'll always have something to say about effect that isn't, it makes the reader read on. Keeps me reading right to the end. So think about using those little hooks to get students to say more about method, about AO2. AO3 is a really useful way to pull your argument together, and AO3 is done so badly, so often, it absolutely drives me nuts. So AO3 is obviously contextual, but here, in terms of context, I do not mean let's start every text with a history lesson. This is a really good way of getting students to think, come on, what is this writer trying to show us here? What message is here for us from the writer? What is the writer's intention, possibly, in terms of this text? By making these choices, what is the writer intending us to think of, to conceptualize? What do they want us to learn from the text about the really big stuff? Life, love, society, politics, gender, all of that stuff. Really, context is the situation out of which the text arises. There is absolutely nothing worse than going in to observe a lesson, as I do often, and seeing people starting a text by giving a great big biographical spiel about, like Charles Dickens and the Victorian era and goodness knows what. students then start writing about that in the exam, as opposed to writing about the text. And yeah, that's not what we're about. So what are we about? Let's take a look at what we're really looking for. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. This one is from AQA. It's just an extract from the literature mark scheme. There are 6 levels on the AQA mark scheme. So there are 2 below this and 2 above this. I've just plucked the middle out of it just to give you a little example. And it's very, very similar to mark schemes that you'll see from Edexcel, from OCR, from EduCAS, in that it breaks down the assessment objectives into these bullet pointed skills. So you can see here this sort of magical halfway mark up the mark scheme. You can see the 3 AOs in there. Clear explained response to the task and text rather, effective references for AO1. There's AO2 with our reference to methods, look and effects, just as we were talking about before. And AO3, that's that link between the context and the text and the task. So again, if you have a look at my little box here on the slide at the side, in order to hit AO1, we want to be thinking, well, what do we learn? What do we understand about the focus of the question? To hit AO2, how is the writer showing me this? What choices have they made in terms of, their language choices, their linguistic devices, their figurative choices? What does that make me think, feel, imagine? And then third, to hit AO3, what is the writer's possible message or intention? So we've got 3 assessment objectives for literature. And you'll see here they operate a little bit like a ladder of skills. As you climb up the mark scheme, you'll see lower down, we'll see, simple, limited, some, moves to clear, moves to detailed, and so on. You'll see that hierarchy of language as the responses become more complex, more accomplished for the student. So always consider the weightings in the specification. It looks here sort of from this mark scheme as if everything is weighted equally. But if you go back to your specification, you'll always find a little grid, whichever spec you're teaching in September in your new school, whichever exam board you're with. Have a little look. There'll be a grid at the front of the spec which shows you the percentage weighting of each assessment objective. So actually, if you look carefully here, this question is out of 30 marks. Actually, if you look at the weightings, there would be 12 marks for AO1, 12 marks for AO2, and 6 marks for AO3. So AO3 is actually worth less in the grand scheme of things. So you do have to check your specification for those weightings and make sure you're encouraging students to get the balance right in their responses. So I got 3, we know now our students need three things to hit here in terms of writing their essay. So how do we get them to do that? How do we get them to include all of these things? Well, when I'm working in class with students, we always begin with planning, and I do a lot of planning with students through year 10 and then ease back a little bit on the amount of time we spend on planning the essays. So I always give them a method first of all. We do a lot of collaborative planning, then planning in groups, then planning in pairs, so that gradually they're able to plan on their own. And they've embedded this kind of 3-layer approach into writing their essays. Got to hit AO1, 2, and 3. So I do that by what I call my lasagna. I do lasagna planning with students. So I get them to plan in layers, very methodical. So again, here's sort of a planning sheet for the anthology poetry here. So if you imagine the task, the focus of the task, compare how the poets present, whatever it is, in this and the other poem. So what do I learn about that focus is my AO1 layer. That's like all my pasta. Then I've got how do the writers show us? That's me bolognese sauce in the middle. And then remember, I have only got 6 marks for context, so I don't want to overdo that. Don't want too much cheese on there. All right, so that goes on the top for AO3. So you can see then, if you have a little look at that, it, you know, obviously planning horizontally, but vertically then you have hit all of the 3 assessment objectives. So let's take a look at a sample task. So this is maybe our classic literature essay type task, the kind of thing that you might get on any board. I've picked Inspector Calls here because it's a very popular play. Lots and lots of schools do it, and it's on quite a number of the exam boards actually. It appears on. So here's a kind of bog standard question that you might get for a text like Inspector Calls. How does Priestley explore, and our focus, the relationships between the different social classes in an Inspector Calls? And certainly on the AQA spec, which many of you might be teaching, it is the biggest specification. There is no extract given for an Inspector Calls. So they're simply given that question on that paper 2 there, for those of you who've maybe been looking at that while you've been in school this time. So if you take a look at that, you could see how I've then broken that down for students, that these are the things that we wanted to think about as we were planning. What do we learn in the play about that? What's implied? What does Priestley use in his work to show us? And what messages could we take away? So I know I've got to hit those 3 different assessment objectives in my essay. So if I'm going to plan my lasagna, get me lasagna, am I making you hungry? Hopefully not. We're doing this at tea time. If I was planning, I always think, let's work with that magic 3. And I might plan 3 ideas in the top layer of my lasagna. So if I'm thinking, okay, how does he explore this relationship? Well, first thing I might think of is particularly this sort of comfortable life of the Burlings that's established at the start of the play, that dinner party that everybody remembers, all the students remember. Then I might want to show my knowledge of the play if I'm being very savvy, and I might want to slot in a little bit of something from the middle of the play, maybe say something about, oh, you know, I've got that interesting difference between Sheila and Eva, Daisy. They're 2 very different lives and expectations with Gerald. And then I might want to show something from the end of the play as well to show my knowledge. So maybe that sort of, you know, that ending where we see the hypocrisy, that kind of seeing if they can all wriggle out of blame, protect themselves from scandal, or at least the older generation do that. So I've got 3 different ideas there that we could explore across the top layer of our lasagna. So again, I always say this, you know, keep thinking in 3s, keep thinking in the magic 3 the whole time. I could then break each one of those ideas down. So I've taken the first idea here, this comfortable life of the Burlings. You know, what do I understand by that? We've got this engagement. Here's this, you know, vacuous Sheila, oh, is this the ring you want me to have, Gerald, with a huge diamond on her finger? All of their privileges laid bare. The fact of how they're cushioned from the real world. They're talking about the strikes, aren't they, and being very rude about their employees and how they've got no intention of going to pay them anymore. And we've also got that sort of very interesting dynamic in the family, very cold, lacking in empathy. So lots of things we could maybe draw out and show our understanding there. Then we want to hit AO2. I always think there, well, you know, you haven't got the book in there with you anymore. Memorizing quotations for me, absolute anathema. You know, if we have to get to the stage where we're sending away students to memorize quotations for exams, that's absolutely the most direct way to kill the subject of English stone dead. So please don't do it. You don't need to do it because it's not in the mark scheme. In fact, if I zip back to the mark scheme, you'll see it says references. to support explanation. No mention of direct quotation at all in the mark scheme. It also drives the chief examiner mad, I know that. You know, how does Priestley present it? What are some of the things he uses? Those stage directions are absolute, you know, they're fantastic, aren't they? At the beginning of the play, the details about the port, the cigars, the way they've dressed for dinner. I love to dig out that picture of Boris Johnson and all his mates at Oxford in their dinner jackets in like the 1980s, and then show them what, you know, the Oxford dining clubs looked like in 1912 when Eric was attending. So quite interesting. So, you know, how does Priestley present this? We don't necessarily need to go, oh, he uses verbs. Let's find something a bit more interesting than that. Why is it important? You know, we've certainly got the social context of the lifestyle there, this dismissal of the strike. You know, we've got all that contrast that Priestley sets up for us there that makes us really understand the different attitudes of the ruling classes there. He's given us a very, very clear message about the attitudes of the ruling classes at the time as he saw, you know, as he saw them. So we've got those three things that we can work with. If I then build that into a paragraph, I'll give you a little moment to have a look at that. So you can see in the yellow, there's a very clear statement. There's a quotation to support it. There's an inference, that's AO1 dealt with in the yellow. In the green, we've got Priestley's method. We've got some references to the text. We've got a comment on effect that is about us and our response, the effect on us, how we are affected by Priestley's methods. And then finally in blue, we've got a little contextual roundup that shows our broader contextual knowledge of the play and what Priestley was about, and linking that very closely to the text. I haven't got anything in there about, you know, where Priestley went to school or growing up in Bradford or whatever he did, or, you know, him being a socialist. We've tied it to the text and the task, which is what we saw in the mark scheme. Okay, so what about when you get a question like this? Okay, and again, this is will be familiar territory to many of you now. You will have seen these when you've been in school. You might get questions with an extract, and again, nearly every exam board has a similar sort of format to this. They tend to be called part to whole questions because they ask you to write about the extract and then show your broader knowledge of the text. You'll tend to see these for Shakespeare questions. You'll see them perhaps for the 19th century novel questions, and you'll see something similar perhaps for some of the poetry as well. So again, you know, they're given this reminder, they're given the focus, we've got the bullet points, obviously, to link back to the mark scheme. So when we're looking at an extract-based question like this, I like to ask students to just use that extract to your advantage. Actually use that extract to plan here, but actually to act as a thought trigger to take you elsewhere in the play, elsewhere in the novel. So using that really to your advantage rather than having students memorize quotations again. So you've got the extract in front of you here. So that's great. You can do some direct quotation from the extract, but use it to kind of satellite out and remind you of other places within the play. So let's just take a little look at that. If I take that extract aside for a moment and do a bit of planning, I would always say to students, still thinking about your magic 3, select 3 juicy extracts, aspects of the extract to work with. By juicy, I mean the ones you can squeeze a lot out of. So again, I want to be thinking about this. What do I understand for AO1? How does Shakespeare show me for AO2? And why is he doing it? Why did he even bother in the first place for AO3? What's his intention here? And then, what do these things remind me of from elsewhere in the play? Can I use them to satellite out to be my thought triggers elsewhere into the play? So, you'll be familiar with this. You probably did Macbeth yourself, more than likely, or perhaps Romeo and Juliet, but you get the picture. You'll certainly be teaching Macbeth at some point, I would imagine, if you haven't been doing so already. So, here's Macbeth in an aside. Quite interesting little dramatic technique there from Shakespeare's, having a little chunter to himself in a corner. And, here we are, him thinking about why, 2 things have been conferred on him already. He's already the Thane of Cawdor. He's been, he's now thinking about the 3rd element of the prophecy. We've got his questioning there, why is this happening? Why have I got these horrible images in my head? Why am I now having disturbing thoughts about how I might make the 3rd thing happen? Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. So we know already that this has planted some seeds of doubt in his mind about his own integrity. We've got Banquo at the top here with this really interesting metaphor, the instruments of darkness. And so if we kind of look at these, that little bit at the top with Banquo, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles. My goodness, doesn't that kind of, in some respects make us think about the witches later on in the play when they talk about Birnam Wood moving and Macbeth thinks, ha ha ha, that will never happen. Win us with honest trifles to betray us in deepest consequence. Let's have a look at the middle bit there. Here is Macbeth questioning himself, why, how can this be? How can this be? Where else does he start to question himself in the play? Think about that moment right before the murder happens. Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. Have a little think about, where that takes us. When else does he have a horrible imagining? In Act 3, when he sees Banquo's ghost shaking his gory locks at him. So, encourage your students to use the extract to their best advantage. Train them to use these little extracts and say, right, where does this take us? Where does this take us? Where might it take us when we're planning our essay? So again, obviously, we've got a possible model here. In the yellow, again, I've got AO1, but this time I've got from the extract and then from the whole play, taken from our thought trigger. In green, I've got the AO2 from the extract. Well, I can see that metaphor, the instruments of darkness here. But later on, I haven't got the rest of the play with me, but I do know that, it's a soliloquy there with Banquo when he is, really concerned there. So I don't have to worry about noun phrases or adjectives or verbs or whatever, but I do know Shakespeare uses a soliloquy, again, using your big box tricks for methods. And then our AO3 at the end. And, if you take a look at the AO3 there, people tempted by the promise of power, they become capable of corrupt and immoral deeds. Interesting contextual stuff there. We've always got something interesting going on in the news. I mean, interesting this week, this week we're looking at, Trump being, in court this week. What happens when people have the promise of power? What do they become capable of? So, talk about context rather than sort of getting all strung up about, James and supernatural books and witches. And, they end up writing about that and not about the play. Put it into context for them by bringing it up to date. What's going on now? That's why we still study Shakespeare. That's why it's interesting. That's why it's a blooming genius, because it actually applies to now. Like, we only have to just think about, you know, people being tempted by the promise of power, capable of corruption, capable of immoral deeds. Blimey, look at the news. You know, bring it up to date. This is why the subject is living. It's why your texts are living. Do not kill them off, is my biggest piece of advice to you as you go into schools. So where are we up to at that point? I was going to ask for any questions at that point, but we are sort of recording this as a webinar for you now, so do feel free, and I'm sure you can let Jo know of any questions that you may have, any queries following today's session. I hope that's been useful for you and not too much of a whistle-stop tour. And just finally, some absolutely shameless self-promotion. This is my new book about curriculum with soul in English, which I hope you're going to be absolute advocates for, that's out on the 20th of July of this year. So do please dip into that. It would be fantastic. I need to persuade Jo to put it on your reading list, on the reading list for next year. So I hope that's been useful, and do come back to me with any questions or queries that you may have. Have a lovely evening. Thank you.